Hi, my name's Pete Knapp, an air quality PhD student at Imperial College London. This series of podcasts is kindly promoted by the Grantham Institute, the college's hub for climate change and environment. Subscribe to receive future episodes and contact the Grantham Institute on Twitter with @Grantham_IC and me with @PeteK_AQ. This is Tipping Points, a podcast featuring interviews with people who've become environmental activists. What made them change? What are they doing now? And what do they hope to see in the future as we face possible breakdown of civilization and life on Earth? This first series focuses on scientists in the UK. With me in this episode is Dr Aaron Thierry from Cardiff. Welcome. You're in Cardiff at the moment.
That's right. I've just started again at Cardiff University in October.
I'd like to hear in 3 minutes how you got to that stage from childhood.
So I grew up in North Wales, in Snowdonia, just on the very edge of the national park, and it's famous for being a glacial valley. I spent a lot of time as a child roaming the hillsides with my siblings, collecting frog spawn or chasing butterflies or looking for fossils, sitting on top of mountains, looking at geology and thinking about how big rocks got moved by glaciers and things like that. So one of the things I guess I grew up with was a real sense of my connection to the natural world, but also having a sense of these really deep scale processes in deep time. And I went on to study zoology at university because I was really interested in evolutionary biology. I was really interested in ecology. And so that developed as I was at university. I had amazing lecturers, including IPCC scientists who taught me about the way that the world was changing. And so that led me to do a PhD in food web ecology. So I was really interested in species interactions and what happens if species go extinct and what are the knock-on consequences for other species in those ecosystems. And then from that, I kind of wanted to do more and more applied research. So I did a postdoc looking at the effect that climate change was having on ecosystems in the Arctic, in particular on the carbon cycle, as permafrost is thawing and changes in fire regimes and so on in Arctic Canada. But really, as I was doing that, I became more and more concerned that the rate of changes that I was seeing on the ground and the lack of action from government. Increasingly, I came to see that this wasn't so much a problem of lack of knowledge or a problem of evidence. It was a political problem. And so I became more and more interested in campaigning. That led me to actually prioritize that. I really got more out of doing that work than doing more research on all of the problems. So I left academia for a while and worked as a campaigns coach for students, helping them design and run campaigns. And then from that, I went and worked for an NGO, working with young people, doing the same thing in further education colleges. From that, as well, I was doing my own activism the whole time, groups like Scientists for Extinction Rebellion, for example. Ultimately, I've decided to go back to academia to study some of those groups and how they communicate and how we can get that message out to the public more effectively. So I've just started a new PhD in social sciences, looking at how social movements use scientific claims in their activism and how the public understand that.
That's fascinating. I wonder then if your interest stemmed from the fossils that you saw.
I think it did a bit. One of the things growing up was we didn't have a television in the house because of the valley. So we had a video cassette recorder and we'd go to the library to borrow video cassettes on a weekly basis after school. And they had all of David Attenborough's videos. We used to watch those on repeat. so every day after school we'd come home and we'd watch one of those. And that was just something that led to me to become so interested in these things, I guess. But there was one episode where he's talking about the paleo record, and we noticed that he was stood on side a valley in Snowdonia, and we like, I know where that is. It's just over that hill over the way. So my brother and I went up there onto the hill with a hammer, and we started bashing all the rocks looking for fossils. And in the show, in the David Attenborough show, he just picks up a rock and knocks it with a hammer, and suddenly the rock splits in two, and there's a perfect Devonian fish lying there. And we went up there with this expectation that we were just going to do the same thing. Yeah, David Attenborough's got a magic touch there.
Yeah. And also, you mentioned that when you were at university, that you had some good lecturers that helped to steer you, and that's often the case, where people get primed from watching TV or something like that happens in childhood, where something really sparks an interest. But then where you go after university seems to be determined by the lecturers that you have. So what can you tell me about the lecturers who inspired you?
As I learned more about the subjects, I became more interested in sharing what I was learning with other people. I think it was just because I was excited by what I was learning, particularly evolutionary biology, which I knew were kind of contentious. Like there's often a lot of public debate or misunderstanding around some of those issues. I used to get more sucked into kind of these online arguments with people over creationism versus evolutionary biology and things like that. And I kind of used the lecture materials that I had picked up to kind of argue the case or kind of try and show, what the evidence is. It didn't really persuade people, I don't suppose, but it kind of helped me understand quite a lot about the need to try and communicate with the public and what are the pitfalls around doing that. Anyway, one of the days on these forums, I got into an argument about climate change because somebody had said, I don't believe that it's happening. It's kind of an exaggeration made up by environmentalists, and they just want to take away our fossil fuels. And I was like, well, I've just learned about this from the lecturers who worked on the IPCC, and I know what the evidence is. So I got into that same mode and started arguing. And as I was doing that, I was looking at references and resources to make my case and really immersing myself in it properly for the first time in order to explain it to somebody else, right? And as I was going through that process, I was reading some articles about carbon budgets. And that's the idea that there's only so much carbon we can afford to burn if we're to limit the temperature of the planet to different amounts. And I think it was reading that really switched me onto all of this in a really big way. There was a penny drop moment where I suddenly read that article. I was like, whoa, hang on, this isn't a long-term future issue here. We're not talking about what's going to happen in 2100. Like, this is about urgent radical reductions that have to start happening now if we're to meet these targets. And I don't think it had really sunk in for me until that point, just how dangerous the situation had become and how urgent it had become. And there was always a bit of me that I guess I'd thought, well, the world's leaders are meeting at these big international meetings and they're all making agreements and there's something going to be done about this. And it was at that point, I think, actually, none of those agreements match anything like this level of ambition. And that's what the science seems to be telling us we need to do if we're really serious about acting to protect ourselves. If other people understood some of these facts, maybe they would come to realize just how important and how serious this is. So I spent a lot of time since then trying to communicate about this, not always successfully, but with an eye to saying, well, if people come to understand some of what the science is telling us, maybe they will understand why this matters to the things that they care about.
How did the conversation go then, after you'd prepared your argument with all of these facts and you're speaking to a creationist to try to convince them?
I think one of the things that we have to understand is that science is basically built on relationships of trust. If I pick up a scientific paper and I read it, I'm not going to really go and check every single result everybody else produces. It's just impossible. So I have to assume that they're being honest about the work and that it's been vetted properly by the peers who've reviewed it and that they're reporting it accurately and so on and so forth. And the IPCC is another really classic example, right? It's the most peer-reviewed document written by hundreds of specialists in their field, and it goes through many rounds of criticism, and then the output is like really, really robust science. And yet what happens quite often is people who don't have that relationship of trust with science, they'll just say, well, I don't believe that. It doesn't fit with who I trust and my worldview. And so sometimes just arguing with facts in that way just doesn't get through because it's not really about facts. It's about this relationship. And so if that community is saying things that go against your worldview or challenge your worldview rather, and maybe threaten some of your own identity, then it's very easy and tempting and often understandable that people will reject that.
Do you think then that you changed your identity the more that you learned about it? Were there things that you realised, I can't do that anymore and I really enjoy it?
Well, yeah, I guess so. I guess it's also really evaluating what's important to us and what do we really value in our lives. And so I don't think it's necessarily seen as necessarily giving up things that have been important to me. It's about reprioritizing things, I think, often. And I think when I've reflected on it, the things that are really important to me are issues around social justice and global justice, and the fact that the impacts of climate change are just horrendous when we're looking at the impacts on the global south. And, the people who are most suffering from climate change are the people who've done least to cause it. And I think part of me is just really determined not to carry on letting that happen and to fight for a more just world.
But I guess, though, that you came to have a passion for the things that had a passion for from your upbringing, and people who've had different upbringings will have different priorities, and they may be compassionate but for different things. So when you've had conversations with friends and family or people who have got different priority, and they say to you, "Oh, I don't think that's that important," Have there been any difficult conversations you've had with people who are close to you?
So what I'd say is that this is a really good place to start the conversation from. It's a much better place to start than, this is the new scientific report, what do you think about that? And listen to this new finding. It's saying, I'm really worried about what's happening to the planet because I really care about these issues of justice, or I really care about having a future that's secure for my nephews and nieces or whatever. Then that's something that's about your beliefs, it's about your values, and it's something that people can respect and have a conversation about. And it doesn't have to center on this question of, do you believe that this is a really serious threat because the science says so? It's asking a different question. And likewise, you can start finding common ground. So there are lots of reasons why other people might have, like you say, different priorities or different focuses of what they care about. But actually, a lot of those things still depend on having a healthy and sustainable planet. We can't have safety for our families, or we can't have security of our food supply, or whatever it is, unless the planet is also being conserved and that we are living in a sustainable way. And so I think we get people to help reflect on what's important to them and listen carefully to what it is that they're telling us is important in their lives, then helping them make the connections themselves to the changes that are happening and to the climate and ecological emergency, and why that threatens the things that they value. Then I think there's a much more scope for us to have a positive and a meaningful conversation.
Do you feel that you'd have more impact as an activist compared to a researcher?
That's a really interesting question. It depends on what we're meaning by impact. I feel that I'm working on issues that are now more aligned to what I believe, and I can feel that I am at least trying my best to contribute to a solution. And like I said, as I came to understand the issues more, I saw how much these were issues of power and politics and not issues necessarily of understanding per se. And I don't think that having more and more data telling us that we're in trouble is going to help. We've got 30 years of more of that. I am glad that I'm not putting my time into detailing the ever worsening situation. I've heard it described as documenting the apocalypse or writing obituaries to nature. And it really felt like that sometimes for me, working as a scientist. We do know very well how to conserve species, for example, and we've got lots of case studies where we've done it well. But the problem is that there's not enough money, there's not enough power being applied to try and take society in that direction. And so we're mostly just fighting fires. For us to be successful, we really need to see this as a mass political awakening that we're trying to work towards. And that's not going to come simply by scientists sticking to doing science in the lab.
You said that you went to some schools to give some talks. How did they go? What did you talk about? How would you talk to a child who has a kind of climate anxiety? Maybe they feel helpless. Maybe they're 10 years old. What would you say to a child who's stepping into a world that they think is collapsing?
With younger people, you give them a real sense of security and that you show them that adults are fighting for their future. And so I think it's not fair at all to kind of frighten young people with this information. That's not healthy or helpful. But I think it is important to recognize that young people are going to have their own views and they're going to be seeing some of the worries that adults are having about these things. So they're going to pick up on that. But with slightly older teenagers, I think that's where they need to be made aware of their own power and their own agency. I think it's really important that we recognize that this is not their problem to fix. I've seen adults say things like, oh, we've messed up our generation, but I'm really glad to see that you guys actually get it and you're fighting for it. And so they're just being passed on the torch to go and fix this mess that the adults have made. And that's just not fair. This is about adults owning the responsibility of the mess that they've created. They're the ones who are in positions of power and influence right now. They're the ones who are running companies. They're the ones who are elected to office. They're the ones who have all of the wealth and resources. They're the ones who should be trying to absolutely do their utmost to fix this problem before passing it on. And so I think when I hear people like Greta Thunberg obviously comes to mind, you made this mess, you fix this. I'm totally with her on that. And I think that there is that challenge coming from young people now. We as academics should be supporting those young people out there doing it, because they're responding to our information saying, wake up people, this is important, do something about this. And lo and behold, we have young people picking up what we've told them and trying to do something about it. And I think there's a moral obligation then to us as researchers to get behind them and saying, yeah, you've listened to us and we're going to support you to try and bring about the changes that you want in response to that.
We hear a lot about the poorest and the most vulnerable being most affected by climate change, and some already have been. But have you experienced any of this firsthand?
When I was working up in the Arctic, I was looking at the effect that wildfire was having on permafrost thaw. In these northern areas, wildfires are becoming much more common than they ever used to be as the world is heating up and the boreal forests are drying out and can catch fire as thunderstorms become more common and so on. Where I was in the Northwest Territories, they have volunteer firefighting units, mostly made up of local inhabitants, and a lot of them are First Nations people from the tribes that live there. And I remember meeting some of these firefighters. They were absolutely exhausted because there had been this huge outbreak of wildfires. They were saying, this has never been like this before, when they were young lads, that just hadn't been like that. There was this kind of real sense of loss and concern about the way in which the landscape that they relied on was changing, because it's so obvious the changes that are happening in the Arctic. They're everywhere. There's kind of a real sense of what environmental psychologists call solastalgia, to mean kind of homesickness for a home that's no longer there. A landscape which had been like that for generations, thousands of years, is suddenly changing. And the whole culture is having to change as a result. And one of the things that really stuck with me was they were talking about the ice fishing on the lakes was no longer possible because the freeze season was getting shorter, and therefore you couldn't spend as much time on the ice. And that actually has a really big impact in these northern communities, because a lot of things are shipped up by what are known as ice roads, where lorries will drive across the frozen lakes because it's that solid. And what's happening is, as these lakes are thawing and the ice season is getting shorter, and they're no longer able to support the weight of these lorries for as long in that season. And so the deliveries are becoming more expensive or becoming more irregular. Another one that happened when I was up there was the water level in Great Slave Lake, because of the drought that summer, had dropped, and it was no longer able to power the hydroelectric dam, which powered the whole city. And so they were having to switch to fossil generators and shipping in diesel from the tar sands hundreds of miles to the south in Alberta, and they were driving them up in these big convoys every day, which was then causing air pollution in the local community, but also obviously accelerating climate change, ironically. That summer there was also these horrendous wildfires that nearly caused the evacuation of the whole city of 40,000 people, which was the largest settlement in the whole of this province. I left with a very strong sense that that's what climate change is doing to people.
I guess in the Arctic you get a sneak preview of what the future is going to be like, because the Arctic regions warm up the most in a short period of time anyway.
Absolutely. The Arctic is warming around twice the rate of the rest of the planet, and that's bringing huge changes to those ecosystems. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact the tropics are perhaps the areas that are most vulnerable to these really rapid changes. That's because in the tropics, the temperature variation that you see from one year to the next is very, very small. So all year round, it's within a very narrow range. All the species in those areas are adapted to this very specific range. And yet what we're seeing already is that in the tropics, every single year starts becoming hotter than the hottest year on record. And that means that we're starting to really risk seeing dramatic shifts in those ecosystems as species have to try and migrate in order to stay within their preferred temperature niche. But of course, if you're in the tropics, to get to a cooler temperature, you've got to migrate thousands of miles. That's just not possible. So there's a real question here about how do we do conservation in a world which is changing like this, because species need to move to new locations in order to stay within their tolerances. Are there questions then that we need to start assisting species to migrate into new areas and to build new ecosystems? And what does that look like? So there's all sorts of really complicated questions that result there. And so I'm really worried, for example, about things like the Amazon rainforest, that actually, it could warm above a threshold that leads to the whole system to start to fragment and collapse. And we're already seeing that happening with coral reefs in the tropics. So the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, for example, has now reached a point where the water temperatures are exceeding the livable tolerances of these corals on a regular basis. In 2016 and 17, we had these back-to-back coral bleaching events, which wiped out half of the corals on the Great Barrier Reef within just 2 years. That's really concerning, because then you're starting to say whole ecosystems could just fall apart very quickly. That's something I don't think people are really aware about. And perhaps most importantly, obviously, is on agricultural ecosystems, which are just as vulnerable. And that ultimately, the whole of society and civilization depends on having a stable agricultural food supply. Modern humans evolved 200,000 years ago or thereabouts. And for the first 190,000 of that, we were nomadic, and we changed with the climate as it changed through the ice ages, and we migrated. And yet, about 7,000 years ago, suddenly we settled not only in one location, but in many locations around the world simultaneously, in the Andes, in this Fertile Crescent, in China, in India. And all of these happened more or less at the same time. And so there's a real question, like, why did this all happen simultaneously when it hadn't happened in the whole 190,000 years before then? And the answer seems to be because the climate of the planet went into a very stable phase, a stable phase like it hadn't been in any other part of the last million years. And that stability of the climate at that time allowed us to predict where the rain was going to fall, how high the coastlines were, because before then the sea levels had changed up and down as the climate had changed. And so the stability of that period allowed for humanity to settle into a particular area and to start farming that area in a reliable and repeatable way. And that formed then the basis of all agricultural civilization, which then developed into the complex civilizations that we have today. And yet it's that very stability that led to all of this success and our development that is now being threatened by the changes that we're bringing about ourselves to the environment. So this is human-caused climate change right now rather than historically changes. And this human-caused climate change that we're seeing is far faster than any historical change that there's ever been. We can't adapt our systems quickly enough to that level of change. Else what we're going to start to find, I fear, is that our agricultural production will start to collapse. And then you're into a world where actually, how does society respond to these sudden shocks in food supply? And who gets that food? Or can we come up with a more fair distributional method to make sure that we don't lead to famine in the world? But that's a much harder task than for society to solve. So, by failing to solve these environmental issues now, whilst we still have a chance, we're setting ourselves up for these really awful dilemma kind of problems in the future. The UN Human Rights Rapporteur, he's been warning of what he calls eco-apartheid, where there are those people who will have the resources and they'll hoard those resources, and then there's everybody else who'll be left to suffer. And that's not the world that I want to see. So we have to take actions now to head off those possibilities, because they are real possibilities.
My friends shared a news story about green oil to say that it had 10% renewable fuel in it. I said that we needed to try a little bit harder than that. But I was criticised for being negative and not recognising progress.
Oh, gosh.
So what's your stance on that? Should this kind of thing be praised?
That's a good question as well. We have to be aware of two things. The first is about what the challenge that we're up against is. That challenge is against a powerful system made up of vested interests and who are benefiting from the current system, who do not want to give up their power and who do not want to be made to change. And they have done everything they can to undermine efforts to bring about change for the last 30 years. And we have lots of evidence of particularly fossil fuel companies lobbying politicians, misinforming the public, supporting bogus think tanks to try and come up with bogus arguments, a predatory delay tactic where these companies profit from delaying action for as long as possible. They will come up with any kind of excuse not to do what is needed Often it's known as kind of greenwashing, where they'll make themselves look as though they're doing something good, but actually as close to business as usual as they can get away with. We really have to start seeing through those kind of obfuscations and misinformation. Now, that's not to say, obviously, all changes has to come from somewhere, and it's all going to be somewhat incremental as building on top of what's gone before. The world has agreed to certain climate targets and also certain targets around biodiversity loss because the world can see how important it is that we stay below those targets. And so in Paris, we agreed globally that we should pursue efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Well, the task of actually trying to do that is absolutely immense, okay? And it means phasing out all fossil fuel emissions within the next 30 years globally, and to halve them by 2030 globally. That means we're talking about really radical, transformative changes, right? 10% on your fuel is not going to get us there. We have to look at what is necessary to meet these targets and work back from that. So if we're only being offered small scale incremental tweaks, then actually we should reject that. We should say that's not good enough. And I think that's, again, part of what Extinction Rebellion is trying to do. We're trying to change the discussion and open up the bounds of debate and saying, actually, no, small scale changes is what we've had for the last 30 years and we're still heading towards disaster. We really need fundamental shifts. And that's going to require us demanding much more from governments and from companies. My challenge back to them would be, how does that 10% change actually get us to where we need to for this 1.5 degree goal? And if it doesn't, what more are you going to do?
Yeah. Do you see then oil companies being a part of this kind of green revolution because they've got a lot of cash?
I think we need to be open-minded. There is a role here for citizens' assemblies to say, well, how much of a role will we give oil and gas companies in this decision? Speaking for myself, I've seen them acting as bad faith actors for my whole life. I do not see them necessarily being part of the solution because I see them as so wedded to the system as it currently is. And rather than accepting the transformation that we need to have, they have been fighting that and trying to delay that transformation. So I think for us to allow them to take a seat at the table, then they would have to really show that they have fundamentally changed what they're trying to do and that they're trying to bring about the changes that we need.
Right, last question then, Aaron. What are you most excited about in the coming months and years?
It's difficult sometimes thinking about the future because it's sometimes hard to be optimistic about it, I think, if I'm honest. That said, I think there is a lot of things to be excited by. The more people that are active, then the more hopeful I can be. People are waking up. We're seeing that young people are leading the charge. And I think it's for all of us now to get on board and support them. And I think that's going to take people being on the streets, taking part in protests, but also lots of other forms of action and activism, from setting up new community groups to lobbying their MP to setting up solar energy co-ops in their town or whatever. There's so many ways in which people can express their commitment to take action. We do need to have this kind of confrontational approach as well, of challenging governments and demanding of them that they act. And what I find really inspiring is the way in which the Sunrise Movement in the United States have organized to put pressure on Joe Biden to demand that he comes up with a plan of action, and that they then organize to ensure that candidates and politicians who supported strong action were elected into office. And then they can hold those politicians to account to bring about the laws that we need to see. What makes me inspired and optimistic are the way in which strong movements that are fighting for justice can really influence political decisions. And hopefully that will start snowballing. We often talk about the Earth system as having tipping points that are really scary, right? We're seeing this tipping point in awareness that's been reached already. Hopefully that might lead to a tipping point then in policies and in laws, and they start to reinforce each other, and that creates a kind of a system transition. It's completely possible that a movement like ours could shift things sufficiently that we tip into a new regime, and that will bring about the better world that we're fighting for. And I think it's that possibility of change that is a reason to carry on fighting, no matter how likely you think it is to happen.
Wonderful. And with that, Dr. Aaron Thierry, thank you.
Cool. Well, thank you, Pete.
Music from Climate by Eric Ian Walker, commissioned by the Climate Music Project, who communicate the sense of urgency of the climate and ecological crises through the emotional power of music. More to be found at ericianwalker.bandcamp.com and climatemusic.org.